Valentine's Day and very special Ash Wednesday wishes for all, a very meaningful holiday on the Christian calendar. And Brock, I appreciate you calling attention to it tonight as we gather. There's some things about Deep Springs Baptist Church that impresses me, and one of them is you know how to have fun. I sense a lot of laughter from time to time when I'm here, but more importantly, I sense the concern that you have for one another as church family. You always have prayer requests, and you don't mind sharing them. And that tells me you believe in the power of prayer. And more power to you. I hope you never lose that trait and that quality. Our opportunity together for 4 weeks is to learn some of the story of how the Bible came to be. And as a part of that task, I have chosen as our theme verse 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15, which Paul wrote to Timothy saying, "Study to show thyself approved under God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." Now, to be able to meet that challenge, that instruction that Paul gave to young Timothy, you've got to know some things. You've got to learn some things. You've got to study. And that's why we have Sunday school. That's why we expect our preacher to be prepared. That's why we encourage Bible reading. That's why we study our Bibles. While we read other materials that are related to the Bible and Christian history. So we will be able to show ourselves approved and able to rightly divide the word of the truth. Our goal in order to is to try and understand the complications of the Bible in order that we can present the message and the truth to the complicated world that is out there. We live in a very complex society. We live in a changing society. We live in a modern day and time where every truth of the past has been or is being challenged. And that makes it tough on us as students of the Bible, as Christians, as church members, because we have to be prepared to confront those challenges and all of that modern day information. We can no longer afford to leave our brains at the door when we enter the church building. We cannot assume anything. We have to be prepared. We have to understand. We have to study. Now, an example of why. Why do we have to study? What's complicated? There are many, many complications in the Christian story. An example is, someone look up Luke chapter 14, verse 26 for me. Luke chapter 14, verse 26. And just let's have a volunteer read it.
If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brother, sister, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple.
Wow. Wow. How do you explain that? The word hate. If any man is going to be my disciple, he has to hate his father and mother. The Bible tells us to honor our mother and father, doesn't it? That one of the commandments? Our wife and children. Jesus taught us to love our wives. We're taught to love our children. Jesus he considered children to be very, very special. We're to hate our brothers and our sisters. Yes, even our own life. Our own life. Or, he says, very specifically, you cannot be my disciple. How many of you hate your mother and your father? How many of you hate your husband and your wife? Your children? Yourself? What does the word hate mean? If you look it up in a dictionary, particularly a modern English dictionary, it means to despise someone, to passionately dislike someone, to even go as far as to seek revenge, to punish someone. That's the kind of feeling hate carries with it. Now, how do we handle that as Christians today when somebody comes in off the street out here and says, I don't believe you people because it tells me I've got to hate? When the Bible says God is love, right? How do you connect those? You got to study to show yourself approved. A workman that needs not be ashamed, but able to rightly divide those words. And what is required of us is to do a little research on verses like that, and there are many of them in the Bible. There's about 1,000 that have been documented that raise questions like this. And when you do your homework, you go back to the language that the Bible was originally written in. In this case here, this verse, the New Testament, Koine Greek, the common Greek language of the people of that day. You find out that the Greek word that's translated in English, hate, is the word pistos, P-I-S-T-O-S. And what it means, if you go back in the Greek culture and study the origin of that word and what it means simply to love less. Now that's quite different than hating someone, isn't it? To love less. That makes a whole lot of sense, doesn't it? If I'm going to be a disciple, a follower of Christ, then I've got to love my mother, father, brother, sister, children, myself less than I love God. I believe that. That's a disciple. But if you just read the Bible straightforward, coming in off the street, no background, no scholarship, you could very, very easily misunderstand that verse. As a matter of fact, a lot of people have. When I was a college student at Carson Newman back in the early 70s, we had a popular movement in this country that was called the Jesus movement. Any of you remember that? The Jesus people? Well, one of the classes that I took was given an assignment. Professor gave us an assignment to go down on the strip of Knoxville where the UT campus is located. Down at the very bottom of the hill on the right side, there was an old dilapidated building that was about to fall down, and there was a commune of young adults that lived in there, and they lived very skittishly. I mean, poor. Ragged clothes, little food to eat. Why were they there? Because they took this verse that we have just read, Luke chapter 14, verse 26. They took it literal. And they said, this is what we've got to do. We've got to forsake our parents. We've got to leave home. We've got to deny our family. We've got to follow Jesus by being separated from all the world. They took it literal, and they got into trouble. And that was what the Jesus movement was really started on, was taking verses like that literal. Now, we can do better than what that Jesus movement did, even though they were called Jesus followers. We can do better. And we are doing better in many cases as a church. But in order to do so, there are some things we need to understand, and that one of them is how the Bible came to be. We need to understand history. And history presents to us a lot of serious challenges. Science presents to us a lot of serious challenges when you compare it to what the Bible tells us. And that's what we've got to reconcile. That's what we've got to deal with if we're going to be responsible and caring people who effectively witness to the world. Prehistory is a challenge. There was little, if any, writing or form of writing, or the communication was all oral. Originally they wrote on stone tablets and limestone. As a matter of fact, I think the earliest writing that radioactive carbon tests have shown or discovered now is somewhere about 3000 BC, maybe a little older, and it was written in limestone. That was the earliest writing. Before that, it was artwork. They would simply draw pictures to communicate. Before that, it was by word of mouth. Communication was passed on back and forth. Prehistory is a challenge because of the difficulty of communication. Now, when you read, for example, you read the earliest, or you study the earliest science today, and you find out that planets, according to studies and science, are reportedly, allegedly, up to 500 million years old. Now that goes way beyond the earliest days that we have described in the Bible for us. 500 million years, some planets possibly existed or were beginning to be formed. Animal skeletons, fossils from sea life have been discovered and have had radioactive carbon test applied to them. And they have been estimated to be maybe as much as 500 million years old. That's hard to comprehend. 500 million years. And particularly when you try to correlate it with what the Scripture tells us about the creation story. Animal skeletons, 500 million years old according to science. Human skeletons have been discovered in Egypt and in Morocco, 300 million years old. That's old. That's getting way, way back there. Way before any writing was done, to the best of our knowledge. And they certainly didn't have any other form of passing the word along, except by mouth and whatever means of communication that they had developed at that point. Written material came along about 3000 BC, to the best of our knowledge. Before that, it was artwork. And soon after the written work began to develop, there was Abraham appearing on the scene. One of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Three key individuals in the life and the story of Israel. Abraham made a covenant with God. Or God made a covenant with Abraham, I should say. And the covenant was, if you'll follow me, if you'll obey me, I'll protect you. I'll provide for you. I'll I'll provide what you need. That was the covenant. You follow me, and I'll bless you. Thus, we said that the Bible, in its nature, is salvation history. It's the story of how that covenant was handled, how people handled the covenant with God. They didn't follow it all the time. They disobeyed the commands. The unique thing about Abraham and the Israelites compared to all other ancient historical groups, cultures, religions, and there are other religions a lot older than the Jews, Hinduism, Buddhism example, is that the Jews were monotheistic. They believed in one God and one God only. And that made them very, very unique compared to the rest of the world. These people, these early Israelites, we call them sometimes, they originally were called Hebrews. The word Hebrew means crossed over. They were given that name Hebrew because they were remembered or known for crossing over the Red Sea. Remember the story? God parting the waters, and they were able to cross over. That give them the name Hebrew because they are reportedly a group of people who crossed over. Let me give you a little synopsis of how all of this happened to the best of our knowledge. Somewhere down in this area of the world right here, and if you'll notice, we got Europe over here, you got the Mediterranean Sea, you got Africa down here, you've got Iraq today, the land of the country of Syria, Jordan. You've got Iran over here. And then along this area right here, you've got what we call Israel, where the Hebrews hung out most of the time, where Jesus lived. In this era, there was what was called a fertile crescent. If you'll study East Tennessee history or pretty much any history of any geographical area in the country, you'll find that settlements took place primarily along rivers. And that's exactly where the Israelites were. This area down here at the Nile River in Egypt, all the way up through here, all the way up the coast of the Mediterranean, across here, down both sides of the Euphrates River and the Tigris River, all the way down to the Persian Gulf here, was known as a fertile crescent. This other area in here that was not part of the Fertile Crescent was a desert land. You didn't want to hang out in the desert. I mean, that's all sand, all heat, dry, windy, hard to survive in it. But you had this Fertile Crescent where you could grow food, where you could pasture cattle. You could travel with water. You could water your animals, who helped assist you or made it possible for you to move and transport various things. It is, from what we know about the Old Testament, Abraham was born somewhere in this area right here, down just above the Persian Gulf. And as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob began to lead the children of Israel, after that, the judges and so forth, they kind of migrated through this Fertile Crescent, we think, all the way down the coast of Israel, down to the Nile River, top of the Red Sea, and even back up, crossing the Jordan River and spreading out multiple directions. And here, of course, is the Jordan River, Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, Jesus' homeland, right in this area right here. So when we talk about the patriarchs as a part of early history, we're talking about roaming this area of the Fertile Crescent and leading these patriarchs, leading the people to follow that covenant that they had with God, that they continuously broke time and time again. But the leadership helped them restore the relationship with God and that covenant. These Israelites, sometimes called Hebrews, sometimes called children of Israel, eventually disbanded into 12 tribes after Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and those tribes hung out all over this area right here, and they were separated. You'd have a tribe here and a tribe here, a tribe here, a tribe there. They really got dispersed throughout this not only the Fertile Crescent, but they even got involved in the desert to some degree. This history is very important to understanding how the Bible came to be, because the Bible took shape by virtue of things that were happening in history. You've got the first 5 books we call the Pentateuch, sometimes called the books of law, sometimes called the Torah. That was the ages of the patriarchs. You've got the book of Judges, Joshua, Kings, Samuel. History begins to develop with the children of Israel around 1000 to 1400 BC, beginning with Deborah, who was one of the popular judges. Israel finally united again after these 12 tribes split. They united into what became known as a united monarchy, under the leadership of King Saul, King David, King Solomon. And then after a while, the people didn't follow them. They divided, became a divided monarchy. Around 500 BC, we have what is known in history as the exile period, where the children of Israel were scattered everywhere. And hard to find, hard to bring any kind of unity. During that time of division and disbursement, you have the Greeks coming from up in this area up here, coming down and beginning to take control of the governments, the people. In the earliest of times, the Babylonians control, the Mesopotamians control. Now it's the Greeks beginning to take over. The Greeks made a significant impact. They were very well-educated people, very intelligent people, very well-learned. We're talking about 300 BC here when the Greeks came in. It's called the Hellenistic period in history. And then soon after the Greeks didn't last long. Their intelligence went to their head, like it does most of the time with people. And they became known, or the Romans, coming all the way from over here in Europe where Italy is, they began to dominate the Greeks and began to take over all this area. In Jesus' day, who was in charge? What government was ruling? The Romans. The Romans were the one that put him to death. So the Romans are now in control and in power of the Israelites and all the people. Now during this time, there were all kinds of materials floating around that the Israelites had kept. Some of it, well, they wrote, they would hear and repeat, they would pass on orally, they would memorize, there would be songs, there would be hymns, there would be diaries, there would be genealogies, there would be all kinds of information they were trying to assemble and compile together. And there was a group of people in the among the Jews that were called Masoretes, or Masoretes sometimes they're called. These are Jewish scholars who tried to preserve the earliest writings of religious nature, particularly pertaining to the Jews, stories of the Jewish history and Jewish life and Jewish belief. They became textual scholars. If you know anything about Hebrew, which is what the children of Israel originally spoke, the Hebrew language doesn't have any vowels in it. It's all consonants. Hard to pronounce because you don't have any consonants, which is where you get your pronunciation from. The Masoretes added vowels to the Hebrew text when they copied it. And that was their job. They were scribes that were continuously copying all of these ancient stories. Now remember, when they started doing their work and trying to preserve the scriptures and more material was surfacing, we had something else that they identified that really has influenced biblical scholarship a lot. And it was called the documentary hypothesis. And the documentary hypothesis is sometimes known as the JEDP. These Masoretes, these textual scholars, began to realize that there were different names for God that was being used in some of these ancient stories pertaining to Israel's life. They recognized the name Yahweh, which is translated Jehovah. They recognized that some of them had the name Elohim for God, El Shaddai. From different cultures, sometimes they just put different accents on the words. And they saw all these differentiations in the stories. For example, there were creation accounts, and you'd have and accounts of the flood, and accounts of the Ten Commandments, and they would have different names used for God attached to them, or written into the storyline. And the Masoretes began to ask the question, how did that happen? How did that happen? Well, it happened because the Israelites were dispersed everywhere, and they were picking up and saving material and passing on material from different cultures and from different directions, different experiences they had. And they began, sooner or later, you had people like Ezra and Nehemiah who were known as early scribes. They began to compile this information from different directions, from different areas of the land that we're talking about. Some of them using the name Jehovah, some using the name Elohim, some the Deuteronomic material, and some of it the priestly material. We could spend all night long talking about each one of those, discovering the characteristics of it. And I'm not going to bore you with all of that, but it does call attention to the fact that we had different perspectives of the same truth that was being shared and was being collected and was being written down. Now, what happened eventually was somebody said, we've got to make some decisions. We got to draw some lines. We got to put some perimeters on all of this, because these Masoretes, these biblical or textual scholars, they're just coming up with all kinds of information, and we don't know what to do with some of it. So what happened was the Jews formed various councils in various places, and those council meetings would consist of any number of people at a given point in time, and they would make decisions about which books that were out there, whether they had the name Yahweh, Jehovah, whatever, which books were considered authentic, original, divine, inspired, whatever term you want to use to put on it. They had to make that decision. And they came up first with a list of books called the Pentateuch. Penta is from Latin, meaning five. It's the Torah, sometimes called, the books of law, sometimes called. It was considered the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, who wrote the Pentateuch? Who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible? Somebody tell me? Who? Moses, okay. Somebody look up Deuteronomy 34, chapter 34, verse 5 for me. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 5. And read it for me. What does it say? So Moses wrote about his own death, right? There's one of those storylines that could come off the street out here and be tossed in the middle of a congregation and say, I don't believe the Bible because you say this, but it says that. You've got to be able to do something with that complication. You've got to be able to explain that. And some of this storyline that I've been giving you here, where the people were dispersed and they were pulling together various materials from various cultures together, and you understand why there are some differences and why we don't understand everything, but that doesn't take away anything from the inspiration, from the guidance that God gave to the people who wrote and who preserved this material. It's miraculous when you think about it, that it survived. Even with the complications that we just pointed out here. What happened in the early times when these scholars got together at these council meetings is they would sometimes, when they put together something like a unit called the Pentateuch or the Torah, they would give a hero's name to the authorship of that material to give it to lend it credibility, to make it popular. Because Moses was the hero. I mean, if I'm reading something from Moses, that makes it true. So they were trying to lend credibility to it when it was passed around from culture to culture or group or tribe to tribe or whatever. And it's important to understand that we have a lot of things that we've been told that are true, yes, but when challenged, you can see the opening there. You can see the question mark. Doesn't take away from the truth, but it does create a complication. After the Pentateuch was eventually pulled together by a council, it was accepted. Even Jesus read from it. Jesus gave credibility to it. He read from the law, books of law. I don't know what more credibility you'd want to give something than to have Jesus himself use it, stand up in the temple and read from it. But after that, the prophets had numerous books. You know how many prophets there were? There were lots of them. Prophets were interpreters of the law. They tried to explain things to the people once they dispersed from the patriarchs, the patriarchal era, you might say. There were some of the prophets that did so well and were so popular, they eventually became known as major prophets. They were considered prophets whose story was very solid. Jeremiah, for example, Ezekiel, Isaiah, those were considered major prophets. And then there were a host of other prophets that fall into the category of minor prophets. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. These were much shorter books than what those major prophets had written. So the scribes, the council meetings that were being held and all, they were constantly wrestling with these groups that they began to lump together and figure out which one should be part of what we call the biblical canon. Canon being a measuring rod or a stick. It's when you approve or you authenticate something. And the councils were giving credibility and canonizing various books. Now there were some of those books, some of those prophets that had a lot of difficulty getting in or getting through the council meetings. Daniel, for example. Why would Daniel be a hard book to accept by a Jewish council meeting? It's apocalyptic literature. It's like the book of Revelation. It's full of hidden symbols, all kinds of things that you have to explain. And people didn't know a lot about those. Another book that had difficulty and really did not even make the next to the last cut before the final canon was approved, the book of Esther. Why would Esther have had difficulty being approved by the Jewish council? What name does not appear in the book of Esther? God. God's name does not appear in the book. You think one of the scholars didn't point that out? And said, whoa, we might not want to put this book in the canon. I mean, they were just like you and I sitting here trying to make a decision. But I believe they were empowered by God. I believe they were inspired by God. I believe they were led by God. I really do. That's just my personal belief. But in the process, they had to hassle some. They had difficulty. I mean, God can speak, and it's not always easy to ascertain what God means when God speaks to you. I mean, I've misunderstood before. Not of God's doing, but my inability to understand what God was trying to say to me, or wishing that God was saying something that he wasn't, or was a little bit different than what I wanted it to be or whatever. I made it difficult to understand. These people had their agendas too, probably. But nevertheless, they finally put together, they had the law, the Pentateuch, and then they came up with the prophets, 2 or 3 groups of them, and then they came up with what's called the writings. You're getting now close to the time of Jesus. About 100 BC, 100 or so years before Jesus, you had a group of writings, we call them, sometimes called the books of poetry. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Lamentations. Those were books that were considered the writings or the books of poetry sometimes. Finally, the most important council meeting probably in Jewish history among humans, human leaders, was in AD 90. Remember this date. This is a red letter date in biblical history. AD 90. The Jewish council met at a place called Jamnia. And it was here at Jamnia that the Old Testament, as we have it, was finally made a canon. It was made a unit. It was approved and has stayed pretty much the same ever since. Now, let me tell you something about that right there that most people don't know. Part of that biblical canon that was approved at Jamnia was something called the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha. You know what the Apocrypha is? It's books that I doubt Brock Webster has ever preached from, if I was guessing. This is the Apocrypha books. There's 3 of these New English translation books right here. One of them's the Old Testament. That one, other one is the New Testament. This is the Apocrypha. So you see how thick it is right here. And it contains books in it that are known as, there's 1st and 2nd Esdras, Tobit, Judith, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Maccabees, the Assumption of Moses, Enoch, and so on. There's at least 14 of them. Some say 15, depending on where you divide some of them and how you count them. But the Apocrypha was approved at Jamnia as authoritative books and canonized. And let me take that a step further. How many of you here are very fond of the King James Version of the Bible? I am. I grew up with it. I make no apology for it. It was what I was raised on. And it probably is the most beautifully written English translation there is. Well, it is. The written, the writing quality, the language, it's just beautiful, beautiful. The translation is very, very good. And now, it's not the only translation, but did you know when King James authorized in 1508, I believe it was, the writing, or 1608, the writing or the translation of the King James Version, which finally I think was done in 1611, that in the original King James Version was the Apocrypha. It was there. Now, how come we don't have it in our King James Version today? What do you do with that? I pastored a church that was very, very progressive, so to speak, back in the 80s, 90s, early 90s. And they had a bunch of professors from a local college, university close by. They were always wanting to learn something different, always wanting to discover something that the average person never heard of before. And they were always pushing the pastor to try to bring out some of that material. I preached a series of sermons in that church from the Apocrypha. I took each book and preached a sermon out of it. And it was an experience, believe me. It's different. You have stories in here in the Apocrypha that are just almost unbelievable. That's why they dropped out of the English canon or the English translations about the latter part of the 18th century and hardly appear in the 19th or the 20th century except in the New English translation and a few other translations. But interestingly enough, they were part of the original King James Version. They were accepted at Jamnia, and some people had to wrestle with that. Now, that's something to chew on, okay? I've gone my 45, 50 minutes already, and I'm not going to take you any farther tonight. But next week we're going to pick up on the birth of the New Testament and how it ties in with all of this. And then the last week we're going to look at all the translations of the Bible and how they happened and what's the pros and cons of some of them. Now, whatever you hear, whatever you think, as a result of all this information that I have been sharing with you, the Bible has validity. Please hear me say that. Stories like that come out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Remember back in 1948, a little shepherd boy was tending his sheep on the hillside of Galilee, and he was throwing rocks into the caves, and he heard something break and shatter, and after a further examination, he found that there were containers in there, pottery, that contained scrolls, and those scrolls were biblical scrolls. As a matter of fact, they contained most of the biblical scrolls once all the excavation and archaeological diggings were completed. And those are some of the earliest manuscripts we have of the Bible, and they verify most everything that we have in the latest translations. They lend credibility to it. So, whatever you hear from all that I say and all the questions that I raise, the Bible, to me, is a collection of 66 books. It's written by more than 40 authors, as led by God, as inspired by God, over a period of 1,000+ years. And the general message of this Bible that we love so much is God's story of salvation. It's salvation history. It's how God restores his people with that covenant. Even into the New Testament, we have another covenant. We change we take the 10 Commandments and summarize them into 2 commandments. Love the Lord thy God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you take the 10 Commandments, the first 4 pertain to God, man's relationship to God. The last 6, from thou shalt not steal to thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet, etc., they pertain to the human relationship to each other. Jesus took them and he summarized it, made it very simple. The new covenant was established. And this time, Jesus died as part of that. And the ultimate part of it, he arose from the grave, and we are saved by his grace from that point on. That's the Bible story. That's salvation history. The Bible is as God's Spirit breathed upon the people who wrote and penned and decided on which books there are in the Bible. They used whatever resource they had to write that information down. It was clay to start with. It became stone. It became papyrus, vellum, parchment, even leather and metals, and on the story goes, how it's been preserved miraculously. But it is God's message. It's God's revelation to us today. Okay? Anybody got a point, question, observation? Moses was the national hero. He was given the credit of being the author of those books, and tradition followed that he wrote them. He may have penned a lot of it. Whether or not he wrote all of it or not, I kind of have to ask myself the question, no, or answer the question, no. But he had a heavy hand in it. Ultimately, Moses is not the decisive factor. God is the decisive factor. God calls somebody, Moses or whoever, to pen it. And it has been passed on and on and on, and it's been preserved beautifully. So I think that traditional thought is probably questionable. But I don't think it takes away anything from the truth at all. We have difficulty as human beings today in a scientific world of having to have everything black and white. It's got to be proven. You got to see it to believe it. It's not faith. Faith is the substance of things not seen, hoped for. Okay? We live by faith as Christians. We don't have all the answers, but we know who is in charge. We know who made it all. We know who will ultimately decide it all. And that's the story, and I'm sticking to it. I think you're right. Yes. But I think God used that and worked through it miraculously. So, good point. Tom made a good point last week when he and I were talking a little bit at the end of the service. Said that some of these duplication stories, like we've got multiple accounts of the creation, the flood, the Ten Commandments, is a continuation of the understanding of what happened in those times. Valid point. Very good point. The question that is hard to answer that science really challenges you with is if you go back in prehistory, and I'm talking about ancient history, before writings and all, up here in Babylon, Mesopotamia, they had their stories of creation, of the flood, of the their own commandments and so forth, long before Abraham. Sorry? Yes, yes. Now, how you correlate that is a challenge. But God was in it, I believe. Whatever. Okay? Anybody else? Good thinking. Good thought process. You guys got a lot to be proud of here.